everyone, and I thank you guys so much for tuning in to yet another episode of My Orchid Adventures with me, Maria Young. So in today's episode, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about some orchids that definitely need a dry winter's rest and why they need that dry winter's rest. Now, I'm going to tell you all about it, but I'm not going to get overly complicated or overly technical because I do believe that sometimes when we get overly with everything, we have a misunderstanding that it may be too complicated for us to do, and it may be an orchid that's too complicated for us to grow, and that definitely is not the case, just as long as you know the fundamentals and the exact reasons of why we are doing it. And the mystery behind why we are willing to put our orchids through this dry rest period is actually no mystery at all. All we are simply trying to do is trying to provide the orchid with as close to as possible the conditions that it would grow through during this time of season in its natural habitat. That's all we're doing. And because there are some orchids, especially your species varieties, that you will find if you do not simulate their natural conditions in their natural habitat, you may find that they will not grow or bloom for you properly. And that is exactly why we do it. So the first thing that we have to do is find out if an exact orchid falls on the dry winter's rest list. And you're going to find that out by doing your own personal research, so you know exactly how to take care of that orchid. But I'm going to go ahead and give you an example of the orchids that I have that are definitely dry winter's rest orchids, so you can have a better understanding. This orchid right here is a Dendrobium amabile. This is a Dendrobium amethystoglossa. Here's a catasetum, Dendrobium densiflorum, Dendrobium lodogicei, Dendrobium thersiflorum, and this one right here is a Dendrobium anosmum. Hidden right here is a Dendrobium nobile type, and contained within this basket is a Dendrobium farmerii. Okay, so now that you have an idea of some of those orchids that definitely need a dry winter's rest, let's go ahead and talk about exactly what conditions they need. So a key fact that we really have to hone in on and really focus on is the fact that all we're trying to do with these orchids is we're trying to emulate and simulate the conditions closest to their natural habitat. So we have to pay close attention to the weather and then begin to know exactly what we need to do once we start seeing the signs. So during the colder months, we have to understand that these orchids in their natural habitat would not be receiving the normal amounts of water because in its natural habitat it doesn't rain as much or it doesn't rain at all. So with this in mind, when it starts getting cooler, and we're talking about the autumn season, you really want to draw back on some of that watering, and I would suggest perhaps 50% of what you would normally water. Now, as it gets even colder than that, well, then you can draw back on that watering even more. Now, there are some orchid growers that actually don't water their orchids at all during the dry winter's rest period. And you know what? You really have to do what's most comfortable for you and what works for you. Now, as for me, what I do when it starts getting really cold, I don't want my orchids to suffer, so I try to keep them comfortable enough to live and survive and still be healthy. So what I do is I'll spray the orchids down once in a while and just as it needs it. Again, just to survive, but definitely still giving it what it needs. You have to find your own formula on what works for you and your orchids and work that formula. And another condition that we really have to pay attention to is the fact that there are some orchids that will not set its blooms properly if it does not reach a certain low temperature. And some of those orchids are your Dendrobium nobiles and also your Dendrobium anosmums. So you want to be capable of putting your orchid somewhere where it can reach those certain low temperatures. And I would suggest a temperature of about 50 degrees. Now, anything lower than that, I would not suggest because it can cause more harm than good to your orchids. So inquiring orchid minds want to know, how much should we be fertilizing our orchids during the rest period? Well, you actually do not even need to be fertilizing at all. We have to understand this is a form of hibernation mode for our orchids. They are asleep. They are resting from their long, hard work. Now they need to recoup and they need to rest. Now, once they begin to bud and of course they begin to grow again, you're seeing new growths and also roots growing. That is the only time that we will begin to water and fertilize our orchids as normal. Okay, so now that I gave you the basics of how to give our orchids their winter's rest, let's go ahead and get a little bit manual. Let's get physical and let's get visual and show you exactly some of the things that we can expect during this winter's rest. And here we are, folks, with my Catasetinae type of orchids. I decided to start off with them because they have specific care tips and culture tips that I definitely wanted to talk to you guys about. Now, with our culture tips, you guys have to understand, those are basically your prime conditions that you want to provide your orchids, basically to grow them in their optimum condition. But of course, I want you guys to understand that does not necessarily mean that that is the only way of doing things, and I'll explain that later to you why I say this. Okay, so these are my Catasetum type of orchids. Now, one thing that we have to understand about them is that they say during the winter rest period that they are going to go completely without any watering. And of course, if you feel sorry enough for them, then you can spray them down or spritz them down with a spray or two of water, but they do not recommend to water it normally. And you are actually going to allow them to remain in dormancy without any watering, without any fertilizing, until the springtime or when you start seeing new growths come. And once you start seeing new growths come, they recommend that you go ahead and just spritz them down or just carefully and sparingly water the orchids, because what they say is you definitely do not want to risk the rotting of the bulb or the actual little baby growth that is coming along. So that is what is recommended for the orchids, and I did that for quite some time, and they did a-okay by doing that as well. But last year I decided to try something new, only because I was so curious of what their potential was and what they could and could not tolerate. So I decided to go ahead and water them as normal, and I think I drew back a little bit only because the conditions were a bit colder, and you guys know when the conditions are colder there's not a whole lot of water evaporation, so therefore the water is staying there a whole lot longer than normal. And so I did draw back on some of the watering, but I did water them as normal, as regular, and I did not incur any type of rotting with the new growths or the bulbs. They grew as normal. So indeed, I want to let you guys know this because these are one of the orchids that I was so afraid and terrified of trying to grow, because in a lot of videos it did state how specific you had to be to care for them during the winter period, but also to bring them out of dormancy, that was such a hassle and also very tedious, and you have to pay very close attention, and it really was not for me, and I thought it was just overly difficult for me to try to grow these orchids. But you know what, folks? With me trying it out myself and actually seeing what they can do by putting them through a trial process, I actually discovered that they can do just fine if you take care of them as normal. So indeed, that is a lesson learned. I want you guys to know, just because it says something in the culture guidelines, they are guidelines, and a lot of our orchids can actually tolerate far more than what is indicated. So definitely don't lose out on the opportunity of collecting great orchids because of what you've read or what people have said. I mean, try it out for yourself and see, because if I didn't try it out for myself, then I would have let them steer me away from actually growing these orchids that are not difficult at all to grow. So again, find out for yourself. You have to find your own formula on what works for you and your orchids and work that formula. And here we are, folks, a little bit more up close and personal on these Catasetums. Wanted to share with you some more detail on them. But before I do, I want to explain to you exactly why it was so important for me to find out if I could water these orchids regularly or not. The reason why it was so important for me to know that is the fact that I am very heavy-handed when it comes to watering my orchids, and also for the fact that I do have a soft heart when it comes to not wanting to see them suffer suffer. So indeed, I will go against the rules if I have to. That is one of the reasons why I was afraid of getting these, because I knew exactly what I would do, and I was afraid that I would actually rot these orchids out. So I am so thrilled that I went against the grain. I decided to go ahead and try and grow them as normal just to see for myself, because now I can grow them conveniently and as normal and without being so terrified of these orchids. Now, the way that I'm watering these orchids, what I am doing is I am spraying them down, and spraying them down rather well, completely, and I will do that about once a week. I won't fully water until the new growths are at a good size and there are a good substantial amount of roots. And that is really the only time that I will begin to fully submerge these orchids in water. And if we take a closer look, we will see that new growths are actually beginning to sprout up. Now, we are still in the wintertime and we have about a month or two more to go, but these have come early. I'm not complaining. We do have to note that, orchids really do whatever they want to do, and if they want to do their thing right now, they will do it, and without a care. So indeed, we are seeing these new growths that grow at the base of the orchid, and eventually these will grow into a nice size and all of those beautiful leaves will come about, and then when they're ready, they will also begin to spike out, and normally also at the base or somewhere along the pseudobulbs. Now, this one right here is my Humunga Dunga Wunga of a mystery orchid. We actually don't know exactly what this is. I do know that it is some form that does need a dry winter's rest. It has all of the signs. I am guessing this is a hono, but we indeed have to wait and see to discover exactly what she is once she blooms. So let's go ahead and take a closer look, and we'll show you the adventure of creating the buds and how they form. Now, one thing we must note about these type of Dendrobium orchids is that they definitely need some form of dry rest period. And if they do not get their dry rest period, and if you continue to water them as normal, you have a high probability that those buds will not be buds. They will actually grow into babies or cakeys. So if you are a bud lover, you definitely want to make sure that they get their dry winter's rest, or you may end up with a bunch of cakeys. And another thing that we do want to pay attention to is the drop in the temperature, because if this does not receive the proper temperatures, then you do risk that this may not bloom or bloom as much for you in the bloom season. So if you've given these orchids the proper conditions, you will begin to notice nubbins that begin to form, and you will feel them as raised bumps. And what you will begin to notice soon after, right at the raised bumps, you will begin to notice that a new growth will break through. And that new growth will continue to grow, growing longer and longer, and eventually showing that definite spike form and also the beginning stages of production of those buds. Until at last you will see that the buds will definitely have a distinctive shape and a separation, and now they will begin to grow and grow until they are big enough to burst forth with all of their beauty. And the great thing about these orchids is the longer that your canes are, you will definitely see more buds on them. And this particular orchid is very, very long, so indeed it is having a lot of buds. And we can expect to see this all bloomed out with a massive amount of these beautiful flowers. And another great and fantastic attribute about this orchid right here is the fact that they can bloom on older canes that have already previously bloomed, as you're seeing right here. So just because they bloomed one time does not mean that they won't bloom again. And the same thing holds true for this Dendrobium farmerii, because indeed they can also bloom off of the same cane that has already previously bloomed. Now, the wonderful thing about this orchid is the spike can actually come throughout the cane. A lot of times you will see them come up from the top, but again, they can grow wherever they want to. And this one in particular, I noticed this nubbin right here, it is defined and definite. There will be a spike that comes from this area right here. But looking throughout the plant, I definitely am seeing some nubbins that are defined and beginning to form. So I do believe that this one in particular will have buds in bloom and throughout this entire plant. And when the buds do decide to form, being that this particular orchid will grow their blooms on somewhat of a grape-like cluster, you will find that the spike will have many buds and it'll actually be in the form of a pine cone. So indeed, these orchids that do need a winter's rest have a definitely very interesting growth structure and growth habit, and is one of the reasons why these orchids are so enjoyable to watch them grow. So the extra attention and the work involved in caring for these orchids during their dry rest period is definitely worth it, and is one of the reasons why many of us are so in love with them. And there you have it, folks. That is a complete dry winter's rest orchid wrap. Now I need to know from you guys exactly what types of orchids are you collecting that also need a dry winter's rest, and also what are your experiences with them, and let me know that by posting those comments below. I thank you guys so much for tuning in to yet another episode of my orchid adventures, and you guys already know how much I do love and appreciate you guys all. Mwah. We definitely have to draw back on some of that watering. So I would suggest if you're watering about 1 time a week, I would only water maybe 2 to 3 times a week. What? What did you just say? What the phalaenopsis are you talking about? Don't do that, folks. Don't do it. We have to understand that during the colder months, your winter, summer, spring, and fall,